My name's Christina. I'm the communications coordinator at ADK Action. And if you do not know us, we are a nonprofit located up here in the Adirondacks of Northern New York. And our mission is to work in a number of different project areas that all work to address unmet needs here in our region and a little beyond too. We work to uplift our communities and preserve the natural character of the Adirondacks as well. Make life a little bit better for both visitors and full-time residents to the Adirondack Park. So Compost for Good is one of our newest projects, and our shared goal is to help keep nutrients in our communities through composting, which builds local resilience, heals soils, and helps reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. So tonight hosting our Compost Café is Katie Culpepper, one of the co-founders of Compost for Good. And we may have Jen Perry joining us by phone at some point, another co-founder of Compost for Good. And one of her other hats is working at ANCA, I just lost the acronym, Katie.
Adirondack North Country Association.
Thank you, Adirondack North Country Association. So we might have Jen pop in too with her 2 cents as well. So once again, thank you for joining us. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat, or especially when we get to, Katie's gonna share some information about composting systems. And after that, when we get to some Q&A, feel free to just kind of unmute yourself, raise your hand, say, I've got a question in the chat. And we will have a conversation about composting. So Katie, I'm going to stop sharing so you can share your screen.
Great. Okay. I'm going to get us started here. Thank you for your patience. Hopefully everyone sees the screen in just a minute. Well, I'll get started while I'm working on that. I'll try to multitask. Thank you so much for being here. I'm thrilled. What a perfect way to spend a Monday evening talking about compost. As Christina said, and thank you, Christina, for that introduction. I'm Katie. I am one of the founders of Compost for Good, joined tonight by Jen Perry, who I hope will be able to introduce herself in just a minute. Not joined, unfortunately, tonight by John Culpepper, who is recovering from surgery right now and would love nothing more than to be discussing compost systems with you all tonight. He will be with us for the 3rd and final Compost Café, which is in 2 weeks. So if you are interested in seeing his face and asking him some questions, he will be back and will be psyched to talk about composting then. Jen, do you want to, if you can, I think you're joining us by phone. Do you want to just pop in and say hello?
Sure, yep, I am by phone. I just got a last minute need to transport a child. So I will be listening in, however, and yeah, this is Jennifer Perry from ANCA, partnering with Katie and John, and super excited to hear what comes out of tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Jen. So we wanted to structure these cafes, and please let me know if sound is an issue. Feel free to chat if I'm yelling or if I'm not loud enough. We wanted to structure these compost cafes just a little bit to give us some avenues to start from, but also want this to be really informal and kind of conversation. But tonight's theme loosely is composting systems, from backyard to community. We'll talk a little bit about commercial as well. And I do think we are joined tonight by Bill Domenico, who represents kind of the business side of composting here in the Adirondacks. And I would love for him to jump in when we get to that point, if he is willing. I'll give him some time to warm up to that idea. If you're here, Bill, thanks for being here. So before we get into different systems for composting, I wanted to get into a little bit about just foundationally what is composting, so that as we're sharing ideas and asking questions, we have kind of that foundation that is shared. And so what is composting? When we are talking about composting, we are talking about the breaking down of organic wastes in oxygen-rich environments. Organic waste is going to break down no matter what, as is evident if you have left bread out on the table for too long, or lettuce in the fridge for too long. Organic waste is going to break down, whether you create the ideal conditions for it or not. So we hear a lot of times people say, well, if it's going to break down, what's the difference between it going to a landfill, it will break down, versus compost, where it also breaks down? And that's a really, really great question. And that's where the oxygen levels come in. In a landfill, organic wastes are being broken down in oxygen poor environments, and that is known as anaerobic decomposition. In that case, in the case of anaerobic decomposition, the byproduct is methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. If you're following along with climate change and are concerned, as many of us are, with what is happening with our planet, you know that methane with carbon is, among others, is problematic when it's released into the environment, into the atmosphere. There are great anaerobic systems where though they produce methane, the systems are capturing that methane to be used for energy. So it is not that all anaerobic decomposition is bad. I don't want to say that, but when we're talking about composting, we are talking about aerobic decomposition, which is breaking down organic waste in the presence of oxygen. So that's the main first thing to know about what composting is. And in general, we are trying to create conditions that promote a diversity of microorganisms. The microbes, the microorganisms, are the ones who are doing the heavy lifting. They're the ones who are doing the work of decomposition. So our role as composters is just creating an environment where all of those microorganisms are happy to get up and go to work every morning. So that's our job. We're trying to create that environment, and that composition of microbes looks different depending on what kind of composting you're doing, and also changes throughout the composting system, which we may get into more depending on where questions take us. And then also, just very basically, we are trying to replicate what's happening in nature all the time anyway. If you walk into a forest and dig into the earth, you will notice this dark, beautiful, rich soil. And that is the product of plants and animals and insects and trees dying and decaying and building that soil up. And so what we are trying to do is capturing all of those organic, all of that organic matter as it breaks down and bringing it back to the soil, building our soil around us. And to that note, the other main important thing that we're doing when we are composting is we are creating a valuable soil amendment. Much of our soil across the globe is depleted. And so to the extent that we can add to that soil to build it up is really important. And a huge way of doing that is taking food waste, composting it, and bringing it back to the earth. And so that's another case against landfilling, is when you landfill food waste, you dig a hole and bury all of those nutrients. And what we're doing with composting is we're trying to capture those nutrients and use them on the land. And so with that foundation of composting, now that we share that understanding of what composting is, we can talk about the different factors to consider when you're thinking about composting. It's really important. Reason I share this is that I want to stress that there are 1.5 zillion ways of composting, and they're all good. If you're keeping food waste out of a landfill and breaking it down and using it in whatever way you're using it, that's good. There are lots of different entry points, and a lot of it depends on your resources and your interests. And so lots of factors to consider when you're thinking about a compost system that's right for you. But 3 that I pulled out that I thought might be interesting to think about and important to think about is how much time and interest you have in composting. If your answer is 0, 0 time, 0 interest, then thank you for still being here tonight. That's great. But if your answer is 0, that's going to, your system for composting, your approach to composting is going to look very, very different than someone who is just super jazzed about composting and wants to be involved as much as possible and digging in it and really actively composting. So just kind of recognizing where you are on that spectrum is a really important point of entry into composting. Another important one is how much space do you have? If you have 250 acres of land and you're excited about composting and using that land for composting, then your composting system is going to look really, really different than if you are in an apartment in the city and you have your countertop and that's kind of your only space, or you have a balcony but not much outdoor space to work with. And that doesn't exclude anyone from composting. It just will change the approach of composting quite drastically. And then another factor to consider is, what are your goals when you're thinking about composting? Maybe it is just that you don't want to pay so much to bring your garbage to the dump. That's a perfectly reasonable reason to want to figure out another way to handle food scraps. Maybe it is that you want to start a garden, or you want to improve a garden space. And so you want to compost your food scraps to bring those resources back into your soils. Lots of different reasons for wanting to compost, and recognizing what that means to you is important in figuring out your journey forward in composting. So with that in mind, I thought it might be fun to look at 3 different backyard systems. So we're going to look at some backyard systems, look at a community scale compost system, and then get a little bit into more of a commercial scale operation. But for the backyard systems, I thought it would be fun to look at 3 different examples. And those are 3 examples from the backyards of the 3 founders of Compost for Good. So me, Jen, and John, all passionate about composting, all excited, all on the same page in a number of ways around composting. Yet if you look at our backyard systems, they are vastly different. And so we're going to start with John's composting system, and he's not here to defend himself, so hopefully I do a good job of describing what he's got going on. John's system. So his system is, he uses a compostable bag, that's that green that you see there, and he's using a 5-gallon bucket to collect. He is layering food waste and wood pellets, same kind of wood pellets that one would use in a pellet stove. You can buy by the bag from a hardware store. And he is filling the bucket until it is to the top, tying the bag, and then dumping those bags into these pieces of road culvert. So he had some scraps laying around. He had access to these pieces of road culvert. So he made a line in his backyard and is just piling those bags up. When that first tube is filled, he'll cap it. You can see in the final picture, there's a plywood cover over that last one. He'll cap it and he'll just let it sit. And this is a super, super passive system. He is loading it up and then walking away, and it will take probably a couple years to totally break down, but he's not in any hurry. He's not anxious to get that product. So this is a perfectly fine system for him. This is a passive composting system that is working for him. Next up is my system here. This is a 3-bay, 3-bin compost system. I've got a little bit of a different situation. I'm composting both food scraps and animal waste. Right now I'm doing that all in one composting system. That may change, but for now I'm happy with that. I'm doing a 3-bay system because I want to be a little bit more active in my composting. I'm anxious to use the compost on my garden. And so I don't want to wait a couple years for a finished product. The 3-bay system allows me to have 1 bay that is for carbon. So I'm able to stockpile whatever I have access to. And so right now it's a combination of wood chips and wood shavings and some ripped up cardboard as well. And so that's the 3rd bay, is just where I keep carbon material. So it's on hand. The first 2 bays are where I'm actually doing the composting. So the middle bay, which you can see in that bottom photo, is filled, and now that's just resting. That will rest, hopefully will be finished fully decomposing by the time the 1st bay is filled. So the 1st bay is where I'm layering carbon, food waste, carbon, food waste. And hopefully by the time that's totally filled, the 2nd bay will be ready to use. So I will take the slats off. You can see in that top photo, those slats are removable. So I'll take those out, pull out that material, and then transfer what's in bay 1 into bay 2. That flopping of material is good for a number of reasons. The old material then is on the top. It aerates it. It gives it one kind of full mixing and flipping, which is good for kind of kickstarting again all of those microorganisms that are doing the work. And then I'll begin again in bay 1. So pretty different looking system using the resources and the needs that I have. And then Jen, do you want to try to explain from phone?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I'm not sure which pictures are up, so you can feel free to just click through, but my general approach is that I have a pallet bin that I constructed that's just intended to keep my dogs out of the compost bin. And as I add food waste, I layer it with various forms of carbon. So that could be sawdust or leaf or straw, hay, things like that. And that's the layering part usually is throughout the winter when I'm not able to actively compost. And then as things thaw, or if it's in the middle of the summer, I have a 55-gallon barrel that I inserted a pipe through the middle so that it can rotate. It's pretty hobcob, but I just grabbed a bunch of old scrap PVC pipes that were floating around that I inserted as aeration. They also, and I did not plan it this way, served to drain off any of the soupiness. If it gets too wet, it seems to drain off just the right amount, which I try to collect to add to my garden as compost tea. And otherwise, if the mixture inside is too dry, I will use the same pipes to water the food scraps as they're tumbling inside. And again, I just add I don't measure, I just add the food waste carbon mix as it comes out of my wood bin. And the PVC pipes also have the purpose of, when I do spin the drum, they hopefully break the material up and keep things well aerated. I rotate the barrel a few times a day. And what I've experienced is in about a month, all of the large food scrap particles, which I chop pretty well before they go in there, are unrecognizable as food scraps, but there's still some pretty big chunks of organic matter. So I removed that to my greenhouse and stack it in rows next to my plants to let it further decompose. And as I think some of us have heard, unfinished compost can actually rob your soil of things like nitrogen. So it's not the best to mix into your soil until it is fully inert. Very unscientific, but it has been working for me so far. And I don't have any pictures of this, but I will add that probably the most successful composting approach I've had is every year I take a section of my garden that's the weediest and I lay something down. I personally am fine with cardboard but you could use something like thick mats of leaves or straw as a base layer. And I use the Lasagna composting approach, where I layer different layers of organic material, and I basically just let it sit. And in the fall, I can stick my shovel into a very rich, loamy, sometimes up to 6 inches of nice dirt that I really don't have to do much to get. I will say that I do add peat moss to that mixture. You don't have to do that. I just happen to have extremely sandy, very poor quality soil. So that's my approach.
Great, thank you, Jen. So those are just 3 examples of backyard systems, and there are many, many, many different ways of doing that, and we'd love to hear from you if you have questions or thoughts for backyard systems. But we do want to do just a quick overview of a particular community scale system. This is one that Compost for Good is passionate about, is excited about. This is what we consider a community scale composter, similar to Jen's. This is also a drum composter. So this is a 3-foot diameter by 20-foot long. And it is capable of processing community's worth of food scraps. And that community is 200 to 300 people based on EPA's assessment of how many pounds of food waste an average American produces in a day. So these systems are pretty cool, and there are 5 of them out in communities in the Northeast, and we're excited about seeing more of those go out. Backyard systems have a great place in the composting world, but we think there's a lot of potential for communities to get around composting altogether, whether it's at a school, which is where a lot of ours are, or a community garden, or whatever. Thermal mass, the amount of food waste, is an important part in keeping temperatures up and keeping composting really efficient and effective. And when you have a community's worth of compost, you're going to just have that much more efficiency. And so there's some really good benefits to a system like this, which again, we'd be happy to talk more about or answer questions about if we have those. And then lastly, just a quick overview of commercial scale composting. Often on a commercial scale, you'll see what's called Windrow Systems, which are long piles of material. It's a little hard to tell in that top left photo, but those are long. That's all bedding and animal manure. And those are turned every couple of weeks in the summer by just a front-loading tractor. And that system works pretty well when you've got the space and you've got a lot of mass, a lot of material. That's a system that works pretty well. And then the short video is another commercial system, same thing, windrows, and I don't even know what this equipment is called. I think its sole purpose is to just flip the material. It's pretty amazing, pretty cool to watch. So that's another example of a commercial scale composting system. And I wonder if Bill, you don't mind me putting you on the spot, if you want to give a really quick kind of description of your business, your commercial system, and then if you do a quick one, then maybe if you're willing to take some questions, if people have them, that would be great. But if Bill's willing, we'll hear from Bill, and then I think we'll open it up to any thoughts or questions that anyone has. So I will stop sharing. And Bill, what do you think? Are you here?
Sure. Yeah, sure, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yes. Domenico, partner, founder of Blue Line Compost here in the Adirondacks. And I guess sticking with tonight's theme and talking about how we do it, our system is actually very similar to Katie Culpepper's. We have a 6-bin aerated stack pile system. And our bins, all right, so I guess backing up one second, We mix all of our material on a mixing pad, food waste, horse manure, kiln dried bark, generally 1 part food, 3 parts manure, 3 parts bark. And we move it all around with a tractor, mix it up, load it into our bins. The first bin represents that material will be there for about 1 week. We turn it into the second bin, and we turn to the third bin. By the time it comes out bin number 6, it's ready to stick or store in a static pile where it ages just a little bit more before we can sell the product.
Thanks, Bill. And for those of you who are in the Adirondacks, Bill's business is a great example of a resource if you are someone who has zero interest in actually composting, but are interested in keeping your food waste out of the landfill. There are businesses popping up all over New York and all over the country, people who will take your food waste. And so that's a good resource to know about. So we're going to thank you, Bill. And if you're willing to stay on and people have more questions about commercial scale, I may push them to you if you're okay with that. We'll get into questions now. And as Christina said earlier, you're welcome to throw questions into the chat or just unmute yourself, throw your video on, and I would love for this to be as conversational as anyone else is comfortable with. But while I'm here on the chat, I did see one question come in that I'll address quickly right now, and that is from Greg, who said, is New York State considering a bill or a law similar to what Vermont recently did, which was eliminating food scrap waste? And the answer is yes. New York State has legislation that is effective as of January 1st of next year, so we're less than a year away, which will ban the landfilling of food waste from large producers. So at this point, the New York State legislation is coming, and at this point is only targeting really large producers with a lot of loopholes, because as a state, we are less ready to have an aggressive mandate like Vermont has had, but it's coming. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing at Compost for Good, is figuring out how to help communities get ready for an inevitable shift in New York, which is looking at decreasing, and then hopefully eliminating the landfilling of food waste. But we're some years out from that probably, although the first step of that law is coming in just under a year. And maybe if Christina, I was just gonna say, yes. So if you go to, Christina just put it in the chat, you can find more information about legislation that's more articulate than what I just did. So thank you, Christina, for being on that. And good question. Yeah, there are a lot of states that are mandating different handling of food waste, and excited that New York is on board. Anyone have anything they want to shout out, so I'm not the only voice?
Katie, I actually have a question as a home composter, and it's
Yes,
a genuine question. So like my family eats a lot of vegetables, so we end up with like a lot of the like green matter for our compost bin, and we just have like a bin that kind of keeps a heap contained, and then I occasionally try to like turn it from the top. It's very not professional. But is there anything like besides like shredded like cardboard? I've heard, so like I'll take like my Amazon boxes and I'm like shredding them up, and like leaves and things like that. Is there anything that's just like easy to throw in there? I saw you had done like a video, and you guys have like maybe wood pellets or something.
Yeah, so wood pellets that's what currently we're using with the community scale composter. We're using wood pellets, and that is what John is using for his system. That's a really, really convenient way to incorporate carbon into your system. It is not the cheapest solution. So yes, there are lots of different ways. Pellets are a really easy way to do it, more expensive. There are also a lot of transfer stations or dumps will have piles of leaves, depending on the time of year, we'll have piles of leaves or wood chips that are free and available to anyone who's interested. Sometimes just your neighbors may have bags of leaves that they raked up, and I think I shared this in the first Compost Cafe. I got, I think, 40 bags of leaves from a couple different properties from a woman who otherwise would be paying to have that taken to the landfill. And I was happy to take them, and she was happy to give them. So part of it is just connecting to your community and or figuring out what your resources are. And if the easiest way for you is to buy bags of pellets, great. If that works for you, then that's a great solution.
Sometimes I'm just looking for like the easy.
Yeah,
I just need to know.
Totally. Yeah, right. And again, there's like lots of different entry points. And for me, I'm looking for cheap. I've got time, but I don't have a lot of money. So I'm looking for the harder, the more.
It's the sweet spot. There's like the three things, you know, it's like either cheap or it's easy or it's like readily available, you know.
Right. Yeah. So it's just figuring out, what are your resources? What's your interest? How much time and energy do you want to invest in tracking down carbon, and how much, so lots of things to think about there. Thank you for that question, though. That's a good.
Actually, on that topic, sorry, I saw it in the chat, Derek asked about like, what are some composting don'ts?
Yeah, so, and on the carbon note, I just want to, I hope that, or probably most of you, if you're interested in composting, understand why the carbon is important, but like that one of the first slides, in trying to create an environment that makes the microbes happy, that makes the microorganisms happy, carbon is an important part of that. So a lot of people troubleshooting are saying like, my compost is just stinky and it's not breaking down and it's just wet, and the reason is that no carbon is going into it. So carbon helps with a lot of things, but it is an important piece there, and we can talk about ratios if people have questions about that. But I will answer that. List some composting don'ts, things to not add, things that you should strive to add, etc. Thank you, Derek, for that question. Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with your system. So a lot of people who are getting into composting are told no dairy, no meat, no nothing like that, and that there are good reasons for that. If you don't have a system that will get to a certain temperature, 130, 140, which is when pathogens are killed and when weed seeds are sterilized, then you don't want to add dairy and meat and things like that. So yeah, a lot of it has to do with your system, your particular system, what you are working with. As long as it's organic matter and you have some idea of what counts as carbon and what counts as nitrogen, you can really decompose anything, but depending on how aggressively you're doing it, some things may be off the table. It's hard to answer that question. Sorry, I didn't do a great job, but yeah, depending on your system, you can compost anything, with the exception of probably, like, you don't want to compost kitty litter, and people discourage dog waste, but otherwise, for the most part, I think you're good to go. If it will rot on your countertop, it can go into your compost pile. Roger, everyone's shy tonight. No one's just piping up. That's okay, but feel free to if you want to. Roger says log cutting wood chip better than fall leaves. Again, I think it's what you have access to. If you have brush and you have access to a wood chipper and you can easily get that carbon source, then great. That's a really good option. Fall leaves. Leaves are great, just leave in place. So if you have another carbon source, you can leave the leaves where they are and use the wood chips. But again, it's up to your system. Both work really well. Both are carbon. You don't want to use green leaves because those would count as your nitrogen. But both are good. Does that answer your question, Roger? Great. I will assume yes.
I have a question real quick about carbon. Would something like charcoal, which is just straight up carbon, has that ever been used as an additive? And if you need another source of it?
Ash from fireplaces is often mixed in, and it is a fine additive. You don't want to be too heavy on it because the pH can affect your end product in ways that you may or may not want. So I would think of it as an additive rather than the carbon source. But yeah, certainly able to use it. And that's a question that comes up a lot because a lot of people have wood ash, and you have to be a little bit careful with just adding it to your garden, although you certainly can. But when you add it to your compost pile and let it break down, compounds in there are more available to plants once they're broken down a little bit more. So you've got a little bit more wiggle room when you go through the composting process rather than just adding it right to the soil. I'm bouncing around. There's lots of things coming in. Rosalie says, I live alone, so don't have a lot of food scraps, but do have a lot of leaves and newspaper and coffee grounds. Any help for me? Yes, Rosalie. Well, coffee grounds, even though they're brown, and sometimes we talk about carbon and nitrogen as greens and browns, coffee grounds are nitrogen rich. And so even just doing coffee grounds and leaves and newspaper would be a perfectly fine compost ratio. You could certainly use that if you have lots and lots of leaves and newspapers and you don't want to, and you're not composting on your own. People like Christina may be really excited about taking your leaves from you. But that combination, leaves, newspapers, coffee grounds, are perfect. Those two things can work together to make a really beautiful compost. Bill threw in there, thank you, Bill. Check in with your local tree guy and or wood shop. They may have chipped wood or sawdust that they have a hard time getting rid of. Very true. The electric company, there's an electric company and tree service people who, are looking to get rid of wood chips. And so if you can connect with the right people, they may be willing to do dump loads of wood chips onto your property anytime they're close by. So again, find out what resources are around you, and do make sure you have that stockpile of carbon, whatever it is. While I'm looking, does anyone want to just shout out?
Actually, can you have too many coffee grounds in your compost? Is it cool to have caffeine in there? I have no idea. That's a good question. And it looks like from studies that have been done on, a lot of coffee companies, coffee shops are doing, a lot of them are doing worm composting. But studies that have been done, it looks like the caffeine that transfers through is negligible, so is not going to make a huge difference. So I would say on the scale that you're producing coffee as a household or even in a coffee shop, you're probably safe. Do the worms just get really active?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if they get they get jazzed up on the caffeine or not. Good question. Should check in with the coffee shop and see if they have, their worms are just like always going, always on.
I can talk a little bit about worm vermicomposting if you'd like. I have a worm farm.
Yeah, please.
It's fairly easy, and especially for folks that don't have a lot of green material. You can set up a worm bin. You don't have to go outside in the cold and snow and such like that. And if you do it right, there's no odor, and they just keep breaking the material down. So yeah, it works pretty well, generally for people with a home bin on a smaller scale.
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. That's great comments. Worm composting can happen outside and can be really effective outside. But for those of you who have tighter space, are in an apartment, or just have a balcony or something like that, worm composting is a really great compact way to do some composting on a smaller scale. Thank you, Bill. Bill, if you have a worm farm, assuming you're not on a small scale, what's your scale looking like?
No, yeah, we have, our basement is full of our breeder bins, and out in our barn, we have a continuous flow through bin that's 4 foot by 8 foot by 4 foot. So we're a little bit bigger, but I mean, it's pretty easy for folks to do at home.
Yeah, and generally, just worms are good in general. So if you are composting in your backyard, to the extent that you can encourage worms in there, worms do great work in compost.
Yeah, the one caveat is don't take worms from your garden and put them in a worm bin. There's like 9,000 varieties of worms, and you just want the composting worms, not the earthworms. That's
right. Right. Feel free to jump in, anyone, as I scroll through. I see Rosalie says, does a compost heap need to be covered in New York winters? Really good question. In New York winters, in cold climates, composting is going to slow, unless you're on a very, very large scale, composting is going to slow a lot in the winter. A lot of the main work in composting is happening by thermophilic bacteria, microorganisms that love the heat. And so when it's like this morning was 5 degrees where I am, those guys were not active. And so covering is one thing to keep heat in. You can retain some heat with a cover. A cover is probably more important in just keeping weather out in general. And so part of keeping your compost pile happy is keeping the right level of moisture. And so if you have rain or snow coming in constantly to your bin, you're gonna have a hard time controlling the moisture level in your setup. And not only the more moisture you have, the more you're likely to trend towards anaerobic breakdown, and where you'll start to get smells, which is in part methane, among other things. But so if you are open to the elements, then you have a harder time controlling moisture levels. Also, if rain is just running through, I think Jen was talking about Compost Tea, which is essentially the liquid that would come out of a compost pile. If you have rain coming in and draining out, then a lot of those nutrients are just running out. So you may have like gorgeous grass around your pile, which depending on your goals may be totally fine with you. But if you're trying to keep those nutrients kind of contained and usable for where you want to use them, then keeping a cover on there is a good idea. Thank you, Rosie, for that question.
This is Greg. I have a comment about the life cycle analysis question with the energy. Definitely thought of that too when I saw the bucket loader, and some of those things are steam driven, some of the drives. For the life cycle question, you might want to consider Energy Institute of America. They've done a lot of that work, and compiled it. It's just eia.org. I do think in our world up here, local is the best place to start, because you can control the variables and you can control the distribution. When things get really large, it gets your backyard motivation gets kind of swallowed in the how everything's got to be when it's large.
I have a related question to that too, for kind of everybody here. I'm just wondering if any of you have any knowledge about community scale composting, like transportation and/or collection methodologies. I'm currently a graduate student studying compost and looking at the current state of affairs of organics waste management. It seems like transfer of these wastes is one of the biggest things hindering or causing an obstacle to getting everybody connected to composting their food waste instead of landfilling them, because not everybody is going to do their own compost. So does anyone have any like success stories or even otherwise to share about transferring and collecting organic waste at a community scale?
Bill, Domenico, do you want to hop on that?
Okay, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, so transport and distance is definitely a huge factor up here in the Adirondacks. So much of the Adirondack Park is very rural. A lot of what we do is drive from community to community and pick up food waste, bring it back to our facility. We are having a lot of success with something we call the bucket swap. So we're set up at a couple retail establishments between Saranac Lake and Ward Lumber over in Jay, New York. But these storefronts become centralized locations where people from a community can bring their compost to one spot, and then we can make one trip to the various stores in a week and do a mass collection. So, again, we're a commercial operation, a for-profit, and this is one little piece we found that's working. I think it's something that people can recreate elsewhere. Urban areas, rural areas, it should work.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, there's also, there are a couple of examples. I think Rye, New York, I might be making that up, but I think it's in Rye, New York. The transfer station has a drop-off location. So they have where you take your garbage and where you take your recycling, and then they have set up bucket systems where you have to be signed up to the program, but where you can just deliver your food waste at the same time, which I would love to see happening in other at other transfer stations. It's already set up to collect material, but of course, there needs to be a processing method for that food waste. So anyone here from Rye, New York? Did I lie? Does that exist in Rye, New York? Anyone? All right, well then let's say it does. I think so.
I just Googled it, Katie, and it looks like you're right. The Rye Sustainability Committee food scrap recycling. So great memory. And I'm sure that at some point it seemed totally off the wall that we would be able to put like our paper and cans and glass out in a bin next to the trash and have that picked up. So maybe someday we'll just get a bucket for food scraps too.
Yeah, and plenty of, in cities that's happening, right? Like there are green bins where and I don't know if we have any city dwellers who have experience with that. At least in New York City, I know a lot of that funding was put on hold because of COVID. And so a lot of those programs have stalled, hopefully not stopped, but just paused. But there are bucket systems where on a larger scale, you put out your food waste like you put out your recycling. That's happening citywide in places around the country. It is crazy for us because it has not been our reality, but it sure could be, I think, and would love. So Rye, New York is an example, and there are a couple, I think Rochester maybe, or somewhere close to there has another interesting, they just did a pilot program, but there are examples out there of towns, villages, communities, cities who are taking, trying to keep nutrients close by and processing close to home.
I would guess Ithaca as well, just from what I know about Ithaca.
Yeah.
They're like Portland, Oregon. They're the leading edge usually.
Yeah.
In Auburn.
Yeah, I'm here from Rochester, so I'm glad that there was a shout out for Rochester. And
am I right? Does Rochester have some kind of program?
Well, the bucket program has been most successful in like apartment complexes where there's a large density of people that, you know, of course, don't have the backyard to do it. So that's been the most successful, but it's an apartment by apartment decision if the people want to participate. And I'm on the Pittsburgh Environmental Advisory Board, so I'm attending to look to see ideas for more of a community-based system for us to follow. And I'm also a backyard composter. I have the dual barrel rotating system, and I had the same problem as Christina, as it's just stuff just wasn't breaking down. So I'll just keep adding more leaves.
Yeah. Did I see a hand?
Yeah, just that one resource or one source of like food waste that is already kind of concentrated is school system waste. At the Wild Center, we have one of those high flow drums, and for pre-pandemic times, the neighboring LP Quinn school, which is literally next door to us, I think it was as simple as one of our staff like drove over with a truck and just picked up all the composts congregated in one place and drove it back to our drum. And just because a school, you know, cafeterias produce so much waste, it was a perfect kind of partnership just because it was already there. So it's like on the one end, when thinking about supply, it's like collecting from a bunch of people, but are other institutions and places that already have it kind of aggregated in a school system. A school, an individual school by itself is a really good source of collection because it's already sort of there. Just, yeah, a thought.
Yeah, that's a great example of, and I think that we're spending a lot of time on backyard systems, but what at Compost for Good, what we're super excited about is those kind of systems where you are taking advantage of places where there is already a mass of food waste. So schools, prisons, hospitals, you get into more regulations as you get into things like that. But schools especially, you've got kind of your captured audience. You're going to have that food waste that's not going to run out. It's a little bit trickier right now with COVID, but there's like a scale of efficiency, right, where backyard composting is great, but I think, Julie, you just said that in a small drum, it's not breaking down, and part of that is that you just don't have the massive material, right? You can't get the temperatures that you really want because you don't have enough material. It will still break down. It will take longer, but when you can build up the amount of material you have, when you have a community's worth, a school's worth of food waste, you're going to have a faster return on your input. And so when we're talking about transportation, the transport of food waste, I would advocate that we're not looking at commercial operations as our gold standard. I think that's great, and there's a place for that, but also we don't want to just be trucking like we were with our other waste. We don't want to just be trucking our food waste. For us, for example, in the Adirondacks, all of our waste, all of our garbage is hauled outside of the Adirondack Park. And if we can keep, I don't want to see a large commercial operation that is capable of processing, you know, Adirondack waste for all of those resources just go out of the park. If we can have smaller setups around so that all of that food waste is being transported less far, but still staying within community, that to me is a win-win, right? The less transport, keeping out of landfills, and that organic matter is staying within the community, is going back to the gardens, going back to forests, going back to wherever. So.
Something I'd just like to point out too is that it's actually really expensive to haul organic waste. It's much more expensive than recyclables because they're way heavier. So paper and plastics versus wet food waste, just think about that concentrated. So that's kind of, I think, the argument to get your foot in the door to say, because of that and the sustainability reasons, we should decentralize some of our waste processes.
Yeah, right. And tipping fees for those who are paying to have food waste hauled as garbage, there's a compelling reason to think about other options, right? If it's just from a money standpoint, there's still reason, even if you don't, like you said, if it's not an environmental reason.
I think that was one of the primary factors in having Vermont move the way they did, because they do realize everything gets trucked out, and they wanted to take control of one of the heavier debris that's going away, like Grace said.
Yeah, and Vermont is really paving the way for, they're now, for those of you who don't know, they are now from the commercial scale down to the residential scale, you cannot throw food waste in the garbage. And so that took several years, and I'm sure there are still loopholes and caveats to that. But there's a state who is saying this is something that is important, whether it's for monetary reasons or for environmental reasons. And I hope that it's a combination of both and other things. But there's an example of a state that is making it happen, has made it happen. And I think on the ADK Action website, there's a blog coming out soon that talks a little bit, that links to Vermont's work. But look that up if you are unfamiliar, because that's a great example. We are running out of time.
I was just gonna butt in.
Wait, Doug, are you just waving, or you have a last something?
Hi, Doug. Quick question. Hi, Katie. I'm curious about the New York legislation and which kinds of entities will be most affected kind of upfront.
Great question. And Christina, do we have the presentation from the 20th that we can link here? Or so on 5 days ago, a couple days ago, we did a joint presentation, Compost for Good, with ADK Action and the DEC, who is really doing the unrolling of or unveiling of this legislation. And we did a presentation with them where they really got into what it's affecting and how it's affecting different entities. So if Christina can link to that, she did it, she's so good. And then also, I think the link that she put on there a little bit earlier will take you to an overview of that law. Ultimately, to like really short answer is that it is only the very, very largest producers. It's like the Walmarts in New York, and there's a lot of loopholes because you have to be within 25 miles of a really large composter, which there just aren't very many. So if you're not close enough to a large composter, you're off the hook. And there's all sorts of questions that I have about then what's the incentive of putting in composting systems if it then makes everyone fall into the category of having to follow through with this legislation. So anyway, check out those links. Those will hopefully answer some questions. And I will zip it so Christina can.
Oh, it's okay. I was just going to say, if you go to the Compost for Good page on the adkaction.org website, so it's adkaction.org/compost will take you there. And about a third of the way down beneath the FAQ. And resources, we have a whole tab about the New York State food donation and food scraps recycling law. So there's a DEC fact sheet. There's a link to the recording of the, I think it's about an hour and a half long Zoom call. And then if you just want to flip through the presentation slides from that call are also available there. And I'm going to put a direct link to them in the chat as well. So I just wanted to share that since it's a lot of good information there. And then we were, I believe Derek had brought up school composting, which got me really excited because in 2 weeks, our final, for now at least, Compost Café is going to be all about bringing, well, all about whatever everyone asks questions of, but also it will be about community scale composting and making it happen in your school and community. And I believe we're going to have at least one student with us that has worked with other students at her school to bring community composting to the cafeteria. So I will let Katie fill everyone in on next time. And I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we saved the chat. At the end of our Compost Cafe series, we are going to look back and find all the unanswered questions and put them together in a blog post at adkaction.org. And we'll send an email out to everyone, letting them know that that has been posted. So by signing up, you will get that email. So if you had an unanswered question, we're sorry we didn't get to it, and we will get them all answered.
Yeah, and come February 8th, then we can you can try to ask again. I'll try to talk less and get more questions through. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's really, really fun to see that people are interested in chatting about composting and talking through ideas. I really appreciate you being here, and hopefully you'll join us on February 8th for our final Compost Cafe.
Thanks,
Thank you
Katie.
so much.
Thank you.
See y'all then. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.